So we're going to work with those perfect square trinomials for a couple videos here. Our first question is, what is the factored form of a perfect square trinomial? And that's a binomial squared. So if we know that we have a perfect square trinomial, a squared plus 2 times a times b plus b squared, factored form is the binomial squared, which is what we learned. We learned about binomial squared in an earlier lesson. So that is factored form. Okay, so let's just put this into practice and see what we're talking about here. Part A, what is the factored form of x squared plus 14x plus 49? So the question we ask ourselves is this a perfect square trinomial? Well, first it's a trinomial. It's got 1, 2, 3 terms. And then here's how we check to see if it's one of those special trinomials, a perfect square trinomial. We take a look at our first term. Is that a perfect square? Do we square anything to get an x squared? And you'd say, well, yeah, you can square an x to get x squared. All right, perfect. Is the last term a perfect square? Do we square anything to get a 49? And you'll think and say, oh yeah, 7 times 7. So 7 squared is 49. Now the middle term, that 14x, for this to be a perfect square trinomial, we're going to check to see this 2 times a times b. So if you take 2 times the first term times, or 2 times this x that we squared times the 7 that we squared, do we get a 14x? So 2 times 7 is 2x. I'm sorry, 2 times x is 2x. 2x times 7 is 14x. So this does equal that positive 14x. So yeah, this is a perfect square trinomial. So when we recognize that, that means that we can factor it. Factored form will be the square of a binomial. So factored form will be x plus 7 squared. Whatever we squared to get the first term and whatever we squared to get the last term. But we do have to make sure that that middle term, 2 times that x times that 7, that has to equal the 14x. Okay, let's try another one. What is the factored form of 9x squared minus 30x plus 25? So is this a perfect square trinomial? Well, let's check the first term. Can we square anything to get a 9x squared? So we can say, well, 3 times 3 is 9, x times x is x squared, so 3x squared gets us that 9x. Do we square anything to get a 25? Yeah, we square a 5. 5 squared is 25. So now let's check to see if we can get this negative 30x. If we take 2 times our 3x times our 5, do we get negative 30x? So 3x times 5 is 15x. 15x times 2 is 30x. But we need a negative 30x. So all that means is that that 5 must have been negative. Now this is a negative 30x, which means this 5 must have been negative. But negative 5 squared is still positive 25. So yeah, that's a perfect square trinomial. So factored form is 3x minus 5 squared. Factored form is the square of a binomial. All right, so let's just take a look at a couple more examples, make sure this is making sense and we can recognize when a trinomial is a perfect square trinomial. So 4x squared plus 12x plus 9. Do we square anything to get a 4x squared? We square a 2x. Do we square anything to get a 9? Yep, we can square a 3. So now let's check if we take 2 times the 2x times the 3, do we get that 12x? So 2x times 3 is 6x. 6x times 2 is 12x. So yep, that is a perfect square trinomial, which means factored form will be a binomial squared. 2x plus 3 squared. All right, part B, x squared minus 8x plus 16. We have a trinomial. If it's a perfect square trinomial, we can just follow our pattern. So, do we square anything to get an x squared? We do, an x. Do we square anything to get a 16? We do, a 4. Now if we take, let's check to see if we can get that negative 8x. So 2 times x times 4, does that get us a negative 8x? And we notice it gets us a positive 8x. So we just need to make that 4 negative and that 4 negative. Now x times negative 4 is negative 4x, times 2 is negative 8x, and a negative 4 squared still gives us that negative 16. So this is a perfect square trinomial, which means factored form will be the square of a binomial, x minus 4 squared.